Good morning and welcome to the 9th meeting of the Education, Children and Young People Committee in 2022. Our first item of agenda on our agenda this morning is consideration of subordinate legislation, the Police Act 1997 and the Protection of Vulnerable Groups Scotland Act 2007, Fees, Coronavirus Amendment Regulations 2022. The committee considered this instrument at its meeting on the 9th of March and we agreed to write to Claire Hawkey, MSP, Minister for Children and Young People, on several points. The committee considered the Minister's response by correspondence and agreed to note and to make no recommendations in respect of the instrument. It is on the agenda today to allow the committee to formally record that decision. With that, we will move on to the next item on the agenda. And the second item on our agenda today is to take evidence on education reform and specifically on the report Putting Learners at the Centre towards a Future Vision for Scottish Education. And I would like to give a very warm welcome to our witnesses to the committee this morning, Professor Kenneth Muir, Honorary Professor at the University of the West of Scotland and formerly Chief Executive and Registrar of the General Teaching Council for Scotland. You're very welcome, Professor Muir, and Professor Graham Donaldson, Honorary Professor, School of Education, the University of Glasgow. And as I say, we are delighted to have both of you with us, coming so soon after the publication of this very important report. So to begin with, I'd like to invite Professor Muir, if he would like, to make a short opening statement for up to 5 minutes, and then we'll move on to questions. Professor Muir.
Thank you, Convener, and it's a pleasure to be here with you and your committee, both virtually and in real life this morning. As you say, I'm accompanied by Graham Donaldson. Graham was one of the expert panel members that I brought together, a small expert panel to advise me. And I think it's worthwhile saying at the outset that the report is actually mine, although Graham and other members of the expert panel accompanied me on some of the visits that I undertook and also gave feedback on some of the emerging recommendations from my report. As committee will be aware, when I took up this remit at the beginning of August, there were 3 decisions that had already been made. One was to replace SQA, one was to remove the inspectorate from Education Scotland, and the third was that Education Scotland, as a result, would be subject to reform, and I was to advise on what that reform might look like. I was also asked to consider the possibility of establishing a curriculum and assessment body, which I took into account as part of my work. So although my remit was quite tight and ring-fenced, what was very clear was, given the very substantial remit and role of Education Scotland and SQA in Scottish education, it was necessary really to take a very wide-ranging view and also to engage very widely with folk, out with not just the school sector, but out with the school sector in other areas. I was very keen to engage extensively, particularly with learners and particularly with practitioners. And as committee will be aware, I engaged with the Children's Parliament, the Scottish Youth Parliament and the charity together to survey the views of primary and secondary learners throughout this. It was very apparent when I took on the remit that the work I was being asked to do didn't exist in a vacuum. There were a lot of things that were going on at that time within the education system. In the early years, for example, the impact of the National Care Service Review and what some of the fallout from that might be. And equally, at the other end of the school spectrum, the work that was being undertaken by the Funding Council in the review of tertiary education. So my work fitted very much into that. And the 21 recommendations that I make really need to be seen as part of a package which is designed to address the remit that I faced and what came through some of the OECD report on Curriculum for Excellence, but also an attempt to try and address some of the long-standing tensions and issues that we've had in Scottish education. I think my report is designed to be a catalyst for further reform and further change. It's certainly the case that the replacement of SQA and the restructuring of the reform of Education Scotland is a starter. But I think, and I hope you get the sense from a report, that it's very much a starter, that more is needed in order to ensure that the education system in Scotland is fit for purpose for current and future learners in what is a very changing world, and with many things that are changing anyway, whether it be in society or more widely and globally. The education system needs to reflect that. And of course it is 20 years since we had a national debate on education which spawned Curriculum for Excellence. We had a period, I think, immediately after that of consensus around the direction of travel, and that was very much what influenced my thinking in regard to the first recommendation, that now is an opportune time to have a really deep think about the purpose of education in Scotland and what we want the education system to do for current and future learners. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Muir. So if we could move now to questions, and I will start with some just background questions, hopefully, that will benefit from hearing your answers to. Professor Muir, why is the SQA broken beyond repair?
These are not my words, but I do think that, particularly in the recent past, there have been issues concerning obviously the national qualifications and the issues that have emerged around that over recent years. I think it goes back beyond that. I think there was concern expressed, and it was fed back to me in many of the engagements that I had, that the national qualifications that were designed to support Curriculum for Excellence were not meeting the needs of practitioners and meeting the needs of young people. I think, again, coming back to the feedback I received from my various engagements, concerns expressed about the extent to which SQA in its current format was a listening organisation, the extent to which it took advice from practitioners and teachers themselves. And I think just generally there was a fair degree of discontent expressed about how SQA operates and the extent to which its governance, and I reference governance in the report, its governance is representative of some of the expertise that exists within schools and classrooms in Scotland. So a feeling, and there were various expressions used in a lot of the discussions that I had about it being an unlistening organisation, a distant organisation. I included a number of quotes within the report to try and emphasise some of these things. One that struck a particular chord with me was a very senior head teacher, a long-standing head teacher, who told me that for a number of years he had felt that SQA had become tone-deaf to what was both required within the system and how they responded to the system and engaged with the system. And it was particularly telling, I think, when I began to talk to folk who were working in the further education sector in particular, who felt that a number of the qualifications, the vocational qualifications, were very much out of date, and that was reflected to some extent in the discussions I had with folk in higher education as well. So I think, Convener, it was a combination of issues that led to the notion that SQA needed to be replaced. And one of the recommendations, of course, I make is the separation of the awarding and the accrediting and regulation. And there was a strong sense came through some of the discussions that I had that SQA marked its own homework, was the term that was used, and that from an accountability point of view, having lost a degree of trust and confidence from the profession, but also from society more widely, I undertook a fair degree of engagement with parents, and I think they themselves were saying that the confidence that they had in that organisation in particular was something that had waned over the years. So I think there were a number of factors which led to the decision that it needed to be replaced. And I think that was a decision that accorded with the views of many that I engaged with.
The functions that the SQA was to carry out, I mean, there's still a need for that body, hence your recommendation that there is a new body created. what we're really talking about, it sounds like to me, is if we're talking about culture. The organisation's culture had gone wrong, had gone adrift. And culture is ultimately the responsibility of the leadership of the SQA. Has the leadership of the SQA sailed the boat onto the rocks?
As I said earlier, Convener, I think some of the issues have been more long-standing than the current leadership, particularly in regard to NQs, which is where I have my expertise. As I say, there was disquiet about the extent to which the national qualifications, when they came in a number of years ago, were fit for purpose, if I can put it like that. I know that the current leadership has tried to make some changes to the culture, but in my report I talk about three things that I think in combination have affected SQA. Certainly the culture, as I said earlier, a very strong sense that it's an organisation that needs to listen more. It's an organisation whose governance needs to better reflect the expert practitioners that are undertaking the very challenging task of learning and teaching. I suppose as a result, given that there have been criticisms of the culture within the organisation, that automatically filters onto the leadership of the organisation. So those three things I think came through very strongly about how SQA is perceived and in some cases how it operates currently. And one of the factors, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, that I had to take account of was recognising that there will not be a quick fix to SQA in the sense that they're undertaking at least another 2, possibly 3 diets of examinations. I was very mindful, and students themselves reminded me very often that it was important that the currency of the qualifications that they had gained under the last 2 diets were comparable to what had been undertaken and what were perceived to be the currencies of previous years. And a recognition as well that SQA needs to continue to deliver as well as change.
But you rightly point out that one of the concerns that's been expressed, and you do address it in your report, is that this new body is simply not a rebranded SQA because of the issues that you've raised.
If it is a rebrand and nothing else, then I will be very disappointed, and I think the profession will be very disappointed. And given what I've said, I think this is an opportune moment to really look at the role of not just SQA but organisations generally that support a very fast-changing education system. So I see, and the feedback I got from many of the engagements I had, that there is a window of opportunity here to have the kind of discussion that's set out in my first recommendation about taking a deep think about what we want the education system to do and how we want it to change, and as importantly as anything, how the organisations that are part of the infrastructure need to change as well. And there's culture that needs to change in those in many cases to match what we want an education system to look like.
But you would suggest maybe that it would be a bad move to simply rehire the existing leadership, senior leadership team at the SQA for the new body. That would undermine the confidence people might have in the new body. Is that a fair comment?
I think the current leadership needs to look at the things that I have identified within my report, the quotes that are in it, the Children and Young Persons report that the Children's Parliament and others pulled together, and also the analysis of the consultation returns, and use those as a mirror to reflect on their current practice. At the end of the day, they are being asked to deliver for at least the next 2 or 3 diets. There is undoubtedly huge expertise and experience within SQA. Some of that certainly needs to be retained, but as a first step, I think the Chief Executive and the Executive Management team, as I say, need to look at those reports and think deeply about how they engage and how they operate for the duration of their continued existence as SQA.
We'll bring in Willie Rennie and then Graham Day on the same topic. Willie Rennie.
I appreciate that this report is far more than the personalities. It is about organisation, it's about culture, it's about broader leadership. I understand that. But how difficult will it be for the new Qualifications Scotland to win over the profession if the old leadership remains in place?
I don't doubt it will be a challenge. And I suppose the issue is, are they able to and are they up for the kinds of radical changes to culture and governance? And some of them can be fixed fairly quickly. As I say, one of my concerns is that although the Board of Management is appointed by ministers, there's an advisory council there which I think comprises about 17 individuals, but not any who have got current practitioner experience. And I think that's been part of the problem because, as I say, it's been reported to me that practitioners and head teachers see it at times as being a very unlistening organisation. I think finding a way in which they can get more of an input from practitioners themselves to influence what they do has to be part of how they reflect on my report and the other reports that sit alongside it.
Okay, thanks.
It reported to me as well that staff at the SQA feel similarly about the senior leadership in terms of their tenured approach to their concerns. Did you?
I had a look, convener, at the staff surveys, and in fairness to SQA, I mean, they were very open. They made available on their SharePoint site a very wide range of documents, all of which I read. At times I think they were trying to confuddle me, but they actually were very helpful in that regard. And some of that came through. I also looked at things like the Local Government Leaders Survey of 2021, which, reading between the lines, although there wasn't a lot of qualitative detail in that survey, you got a sense that there was something amiss within SQA in terms of the views of chief executives of councils, council leaders, directors of education, the levels of confidence in SQA. So all of that pointing very much to an organisation that really needs to take a long, hard look at itself, or a short, hard look at itself, more likely, as opposed to a long, hard look.
And then take the appropriate action, yeah.
Yeah, so there are a number of things that point towards, as I say, culture, leadership and governance that I think are three keys that current executive management team needs to consider.
Bring in Graham Day. How far back do you think this issue has been existent?
It's been difficult to say. I think it's been... It probably goes slightly longer than the COVID period, to be honest, because, as I say, I think there was some disquiet, and, of course, over recent years we've had the issue about unit assessments within national qualifications and whether they're part of it and whether they're not. So all of that, and I think how it was handled generally, contributed to a very strong view that the organisation needed to be at least reformed, if not replaced. But I think it's been exacerbated by COVID, to be quite truthful. I mean, I sat myself in my previous existence on the COVID Education Recovery Group, and I know some of the challenges that SQA went through in looking at the options, the scenarios, if a diet didn't exist and so on. So I think it's been exacerbated in the last few years, to be quite honest, by COVID. And of course, they've had a change of chief executive as well. It's never easy coming into an organisation as a new chief executive and trying to make your mark in that organisation. I think some of what the chief executive has done has begun to work. I think the comms is improving to a degree, but not entirely, as we've maybe seen from some of the recent press and media coverage. But I think it's an organisation that still has some way to go.
Graham Day.
Thank you, Convener, and morning, Professor Muir. As has already been touched upon, some of the respondents to the consultation expressed concerns that the reforms were simply rebranding of the current system. Now, we all know that cynicism is always going to be there in this sort of process. But what I'd like to explore with you is to get your view on this. Do you believe that the Scottish Government's response to the OECD report and thereafter to your report offers a genuine reassurance that certainly at Scottish Government level there is a recognition of the need to reform fully and a commitment to that process?
there's nothing, Mr Day, in any of the engagements I've had with Scottish Government to suggest that they're not up for reform. I think they recognise that the world has changed significantly and continues to change, and the education system needs to respond to that. So in that sense, I think there is an acceptance that the system needs to change. I think in terms of the government's response to my report, as I said in my opening statement, I think there are a number of things that are happening out with the school education sector that I've had to take into account, and some of the recommendations and some of government's response are perhaps a bit more tentative than I might have wanted them to have been. If I point to, for example, the decision not to include the Scottish Credit and Qualifications Framework within the proposed national agency, I think that's a disappointment to me, but at the same time, my sense is that the government's response said that they recognise the value of the SCQF and the partnership body that runs it, and that there is a need to heighten the profile significantly of the Scottish Credit and Qualifications Framework. The Inspectorate, I am very clear as a former HMI myself, having worked with Graham when he was the Senior Chief Inspector, that it needs to be a very independent body that is able to inform yourselves. I mean, the expression that gets used about talking truth to power, I think, absolutely comes through having an independent inspectorate. I suggest in my report that it's either a non-ministerial office or a national body akin to the likes of Audit Scotland reporting to Parliament rather than to ministers. I think that helps to build trust and confidence in the education system, to have an independent body that is a step removed in that way. So I can understand why some of the responses have been a bit tentative. Some of them are also dependent on the fallout from the tertiary review that's underway. Some of it's determined, as I said earlier in my opening statement, about how the National Care Service review plays out and what falls out from that. So, as I say, I can understand why some of the government's response has been a bit tentative, but I think some of it has needed to be. So, for example, primary legislation being required for some of the changes. I know, you all know, that will take a bit of time and so on. But I think if it is nothing more, as I was suggesting earlier, Mr Day, that it's a rebranding of two major organisations, then I'll have wasted 6 months. And I think more than anything, I think the expectation that's out there that change and reform will come will land sorely with teachers and practitioners and head teachers.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Thank you. And just one more question from me before we come back to Willie Rennie. Sorry, beg your pardon. Yes, please, Michael Mara.
Thanks, Convener. And since it's my first time to speak, thanks to you both, in particular yourself, Professor Muir, for a report which I think your care for young people in Scotland and their future prospects shines through it in every page, for the long-term aspiration you have for the country and for our young people. So thank you for all that work. But I want to focus a little bit on the short term, if that's okay. Some of the questions my colleagues have asked about leadership. I mean, your report and your commission to do this work was precipitated by a crisis of confidence in the SQA through the disastrous handling through the pandemic. I think we all recognise that. That's why you're sitting here today and why we've got this report in front of us. We're now looking at that organisation staying in place for another 3 exam diets, the current one, another 2. I mean, should we have confidence in that leadership if there was another crisis for them to take those decisions?
I would hope, Mr Mara, that SQA has learned from the last 2 years. And I think as long as we have COVID hanging there, we have an organisation that, because of the public profile of qualifications and examinations, is going to have to consider a number of options, as it has over the last 2 years, and some of those having to be implemented at very short notice. So I have a degree of sympathy with SQA in that regard. But as I said in my earlier response, I think it's really important that, given that SQA will continue to exist, that a fair amount of the expertise and specialisms that are required are in there that need to be in place to undertake a national diet of examinations. I think it's important that in the very short term, as I say, the SQA leadership looks at themselves and asks themselves, do we have the capacity, do we have the culture, do we have the organisational will to make the changes that are necessary? I think the changes are very clear from my report. As I say, if you look at the other reports, there's much more detail in them. I could have included other quotes and comments that were made to me that were significantly more damning. I've tried to be very balanced in what I've said in the report in terms of the feedback. I think one of the things that isn't well understood out there in the system generally, particularly the school system, is the breadth of qualifications that SQA offers. And I have to say that some of the feedback that I got from those who are training providers or those who are operating in the vocational sphere, much more so than the national qualification sphere, very positive about the work that SQA has done. The reason that I chose to separate out the accreditation and regulation, as I say, is to try and give a very clear indication that trust and confidence in SQA needs to be improved. It needs to have someone and somebody looking at it from afar, as opposed to having a regulatory and accreditation function built into its system. I think it will be a challenge, and I don't think it's necessarily for me to say what should happen to that board, but I do think there are questions that need to be asked of the executive management team, the chief executive, and the board, because there is a management board in there, all of whom have come under criticism in some of the discussions and engagements that I have had. So I think there, as much as anything, I think it's for them to decide or to make a determination as to whether they think they have the capacity and possibly in some cases the will to lead the organisation forward in what is undoubtedly going to be a period of significant challenge and change. Because not only, as you say, Mr Marrow, they're delivering the next 3 diets, they are going to have to take pay very close attention to the reforms that are coming down the track.
Thanks, Kabir. Thank you.
Thank you. And I was going to ask one very, I say quick question, but it's probably not a quick question, but we'll try and deal with it quickly. You deliberately, I think, have put as your first recommendation a national discussion about the future of curriculum for excellence, in light also of the OECD commentary on curriculum for excellence. And in the report, you say there was generally agreement with the OECD that curriculum for excellence is still part of the direction of travel, and confirmation that its underpinning philosophy was still sound. And then you go on to talk about the need for change, as opposed to a clear message required for change. In the report, you quote one of the consultation findings, which was that 58% agreed that the vision for curriculum for excellence reflects what matters for the education of children and young people in Scotland. But can I ask you to comment on the second top finding in the consultation, which was when asked to agree whether curriculum for excellence gives the best possible educational experience for our young people and enables them to realise their ambitions, only 22%, 1 in 5, were able to say that they felt that they could agree with that statement. When you talk about change, Professor Muir, we're really looking at a major overhaul of curriculum for excellence if it's failing to deliver on educational experience, best possible educational experience, and realisation of ambition, surely.
I think, if you don't mind, Kavir, I'll ask maybe Graham to say something on this as well, because he was party to the creation of Curriculum for Excellence after the last national debate, which, as I say, spawned Curriculum for Excellence. I think we need to bear in mind that there are some teachers and some schools where children get an excellent deal. I don't think there's any doubt about that, and they have gone to the ends of the earth to try and make Curriculum for Excellence work. Curriculum for Excellence is 20 years old, the thinking and the philosophy behind it. There are some teachers who, Ms Stewart and others, who are part of the committee, who know how hard it has been to introduce Curriculum for Excellence. A very, very different philosophy. First time ever in Scottish education we've tried to change the entire system at once. We've tended to do it in bits and pieces in the past. So I think we need to remember that there are children and young people in Scottish schools who are getting a very good deal through Curriculum for Excellence. I think what has happened is that the world has moved on in 20 years. The expectations of what we want from an education system in Scottish society has changed hugely. And it's changing even more quickly as we move on, which is one of the reasons why I think this report, and I think whatever comes out of Professor Hayward's report on the reform of the national qualifications, or the review of the national qualifications, gives us a window of time to make a decision about and get a consensus on what we want the education system to look like. So I think it is important that I say that I've seen it as an inspector myself. A lot of the feedback that I had was really just confirming how hard schools are working to implement Curriculum for Excellence. But it is true that it doesn't meet the needs of all children and young people. And that is one of the reasons why the central message in my report is that we really need to turn everything in the education system. All of the telescopes need to focus very much on meeting the needs of learners first and foremost. That has to be the prime objective of what we do in education. And in order to do that, we need to put in an infrastructure that supports the learning and teaching and supports teachers and practitioners. And again, I hope that comes through very strongly in the report. But I think in order to do that and to make any further change to the infrastructure, I do think we need to take the time to ask the kind of questions we asked 20 years ago. What do we want the education system to do for the next generation? And that needs a consensual vision that is agreed by all parties, political and otherwise, I have to say, because I think one of the things that we had for 4 or 5 years after the introduction of Curriculum for Excellence was absolute consensus around the direction of travel. Where I think it began to come off the rails was we didn't do enough to explain the philosophy of CFE to teachers and what that then meant for practice. And we didn't do enough to communicate with parents around what Curriculum for Excellence was trying to do and why the national qualifications needed to be different to what we had before. So I think that making that first and second recommendation is really saying this is a good time to have that discussion, but it needs to be an all-embracing discussion. And critically, it needs to take account of the views of teachers who are experts in the profession and just as importantly, learners themselves. Because some of the most interesting engagements that I had, and Graham was party to some of them, were with children and young people. They know what they want from an education system, and it's not just about being driven by examinations. And when you get below the skin of what children and young people say about what they want from their experience in schools, it's far more than just attainment, important though that is. So how do we embrace all of that within a national discussion, I think is a really important way forward. But as I say, Graham was party to the creation of Curriculum for Excellence. I don't know whether, Graham, you might want to say something on that.
Yeah, I was head of the Inspectorate during the period that the reforms, but the Great Debate took place and the reforms that followed from it. So I was engaging with ministers and with the Parliament, with your predecessor committees, quite extensively during that period. I think Ken's point, it's 20 years ago that debate took place. Curriculum for Excellence and OECD referred to this. Curriculum for Excellence departed dramatically from conventional wisdom about what a curriculum should look like. And actually, over the course of the last 20 years, what we've seen internationally is country after country moving in that direction. So that prior to 2000, 2004, essentially a curriculum was about a definition of what young people should learn. It sounds pretty obvious. That's what a curriculum was about. But what Curriculum for Excellence said was, of course that's important, but actually it is how they use that learning and what they become as a result of that learning, that the school also has a responsibility not just to give them the learning they require and then test whether they've got it or not, but actually to see whether or not they have the capacity, and that's what those 4 capacities are about, the capacity to learn and then to be able to contribute, to be able to engage as 21st century citizens, to think through some of the complex issues. So Curriculum for Excellence was a very radical departure at the time. And interestingly, OECD currently have what they call a 2030 project, which is looking at their view of what the curriculum should look like in 2030. It looks awfully like Curriculum for Excellence. Not the same, but it's the same kind of thrust of thinking about building capacity and competence in young people, helping them to grow as people, as well as simply to acquire pre-specified learning. But a curriculum doesn't deliver anything. You know, I mean, a curriculum is inert. It is totally dependent on what happens as a result of that. And I think, as Ken said, over that 20-year period, I think partly we've lost the narrative. I think if you ask people what Curriculum for Excellence is, ask even in schools, ask them, you'll give it 20 different answers. Because in a sense it's become too diffuse and it's been influenced by the way in which events have shaped things over the course of over the course of the last 20 years. And in particular, I think, in the senior phase, and that goes back to the questions you've been raising about SQA and examinations. Just as an aside, examination boards are nigh to nothing. You know, it's a very, very difficult thing to do to maintain standards reliably over time. I think that the problem back in 2000, when there was the meltdown in relation to examinations in Scotland, has created an SQH which is very risk averse. It's an organisation which has been thinking about whatever we do, we mustn't be back in where we were in 2000. And I think that was quite influential in terms of the way in which the examination process, the qualification process was developed in relation to the curriculum thinking that had taken previously. So I think what we got was a very conservative, fairly narrow interpretation of what it was that curriculum philosophy was about. And therefore you got this, which comes through in Ken's report, you got this mismatch between what schools thought they were doing in relation to the bit that went before, and then in secondary schools in particular, now we get down to serious stuff, and the serious stuff doesn't look awfully different from the serious stuff looked before. And therefore we got that disjuncture between a curriculum philosophy and an examination and the practicalities of examinations. And also, I think, partly because of the 2000 situation, SQA were given a governance structure which I hadn't quite realised, I have to say, when I looked at it in working with Ken. The Board of Management seems to me to be very narrowly conceived, and it's not really surprising that it's a Board of Management that's not really in touch with issues of the classroom and of learning and teaching, because it's a very, I think it's a Board of Management that was set up in order to avoid risk, to manage the organisation very tightly and avoid risk. But it wasn't a Board of Management that was designed to think about the nature of what are children, what's the learning that ought to be taking place, and how can we best provide qualifications that reflect the learning. And that means you have to look two ways. You have to look at business, at universities, at FE colleges, and see the qualifications have got to serve them, but they've also got to look back and they've got to reflect the learning that's built up over the course of the period. So when we talk about Curriculum for Excellence, it is only a curriculum, and it's only as good as the context within which it actually is taking place. In secondaries, there's been a serious issue, I think, in terms of the disjuncture between the examinations and the curriculum philosophy. And in primaries, I do think we lost the narrative a bit in primaries, that the 4 capacities became something that everyone could subscribe to. But they're only worthwhile if you really drill down and there's real rigour and depth to those 4 capacities. So you've really got to think, what does that really mean? Because you can call anything creating a confident individual, or it's not hard to do that. So you really got to stick at it and drill down, and so the young people are being challenged. That the whole business of developing those capacities should be a very rigorous process. It should be one that is challenging, also enjoyable, but challenging for young people. And I think to some extent we kind of lost the flow that was intended originally in Curriculum for Excellence. So having a debate now, which is Ken's recommendation, seems to me 20 years on. I've been involved in a number of OECD reviews, and it's interesting. I did a review with more or less the same team in Japan of Japanese education. And Japan have a formal 10-year review of the curriculum. So that's just automatic. And that kind of depoliticizes it. You don't review it because you've got a problem. Review it because, of course, you review it. Of course, it needs to change. Of course, you need to update it. So it needs to be kept under constant, under that process of review. So I think Curriculum for Excellence is used as a label, but actually it's what lies behind how we achieve the aspirations that were in that original curriculum. And we ask ourselves the hard question, which is very much in Ken's report, is given where we are now, given all the disruptors that are around just now, and you heard me talking about this earlier, so I'll not go on about it here, but I mean, we have got particularly technology, just changing the nature of learning and teaching over the course of the next decade dramatically through artificial intelligence, through the so-called metaverse. All of that is going to impact on schools very, very dramatically. We need to think very hard about the nature of the curriculum that we need, that is going to work with the grain of those changes in the learning context that young people need to have, let alone sustainability, let alone all the geopolitical implications of what's happening currently in Ukraine. So the time is right for that debate, absolutely right, I think, for a debate of that kind. And that's why I think that recommendation in Ken's report is so important. And I hope we can have our genuine debate. Not the great and the good think something and say, do you like it? But actually one that engages people, which actually was pretty well done back in the first flush of this Parliament in the early part of the century.
Genuine national discussion, but that was a pretty strong endorsement of that first recommendation of the report, and I appreciate that. Willie Rennie.
So I want to come to child protection in a second, but first, just about Education Scotland and the new national agency, because that's, I think, the next meaty part of the report. You talked about a cluttered landscape, patchy delivery, schools, teachers felt bombarded with the material that's provided, and you talk very much about a teacher kind of responsive approach. To be honest, I'm not really sure what that means. I get the idea, but what would a teacher notice in terms of the difference with this new national agency compared with what they're receiving now?
I think what I'm trying to suggest in that report and in the creation of this national agency, Mr Rennie, is that teachers at the moment get a variable experience in terms of the support that's available to them. So currently Education Scotland has a national office or a national offer, a lot around leadership and professional learning. But what teachers were saying to me were very mixed messages. Some of them felt that suited their needs, but others didn't. So what would they notice in this new agency? A much more responsive and reactive agency to what teachers themselves are saying they need in order to undertake that very difficult task of teaching and learning. And within the report, what I've tried to do is to say that one of the issues at the moment, and I think Education Scotland recognise this themselves, is that they're facing different ways. They're facing government, they're trying to face the profession, they're trying to work with local authorities through regional improvement collaboratives. Some of that's working very well, in fairness, but it's not working well enough consistently. So in creating an agency that is aligned with the philosophy that you put the child very much at the centre, that that is the prime focus of what the education system is about. The next level then is to say, so how do you ensure that the teachers and the practitioners who are supporting that learning get the support and the professional learning that they require? It's not determined by a national agency or by a national organisation. It's determined by those who are actually engaged in that critical learning and teaching process. And it goes back to what Graham was saying. It's one of the reasons why I rejected the notion of a purely curriculum and assessment agency, because very often, I mean, there are different interpretations of curriculum, but most folks see it in a very traditional sense, that it's about the content and the delivery of that content. What a curriculum and assessment agency, I think, ran the risk of doing was missing out that really important element of learning and teaching. So a lot of what is in my report is very much orientated towards improving learning and teaching, that then will allow outcomes for learners to be better met. And that agency I saw being one where the resource was much more localised, it was much more responsive, and it was much more responding to the bespoke requests of schools and individual teachers as to the support that they require to make learning and teaching effective. So I think that if we can create that kind of agency that brings together not just the opportunities for professional learning at a local level, but brings in the opportunity for teachers and practitioners, head teachers and so on, to feel that they have a role to play in creating the education system. Because at the moment, a lot of the feedback that I get is that it's still a very hierarchical system that we have in Scotland. It's a very top-down system. It's driven from the top. A key message that I've tried to embed within the report is that we actually need to turn that around. And we need to start with the learner. And we need to start with the teachers and the practitioners and make sure that they are supported. And one of the ways of doing that is through looking again at the role of what is currently regional improvement collaboratives, but in fact, my report talks more about regional collaboration and local collaboration, because a lot of teachers have fallen back on that. Those who are critical of the support that they received during COVID, a lot of them found salvation through their informal networks. So, you know, organisations that at a national level are producing resources for teachers, you know, Royal Scottish Geographical Society, Scottish Geography Teachers, Modern Studies Association, the Teacher of History and so on. There are lots of national organisations there that are populated by expert volunteers who are very, very committed to their subject, but also to learning and teaching. So a lot of them have fallen back in that, but recreating that kind of model where teachers' needs are being responded to just as much as learners' needs are being responded to is very much the kind of central philosophy of what I saw in that national agency.
So you talk about the hierarchy and the top-down approach. So are you saying this national agency will almost have a filtering, a gatekeeping role to make sure that the teachers, the education providers, are put first, and that any kind of interference that contradicts that, you know, this national agency will have a role in filtering that? Because you talk about coordination, coherence within the report. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and that's part of the thinking, Mr. Rennie, behind that that agency, is that by bringing together you know, what I had intended within my recommendations, bringing in SCQF, bringing in the Insight team, bringing in part of the Curriculum and Qualifications division within Scottish Government with, you know, an eye to policy, bringing that all together, all of the key decisions that are taken about direction of travel and so on all sit within a single agency, and it's then in itself providing a greater level of coherence to the thinking and the provision of support and resource that is then going into schools and into classrooms. So it is very much about trying to ensure that some of the variations of interpretation that exists out there in the system around policy and so on, there's less chance of that being a fragmented interpretation if it, to use your words, it's filtered through, but through a central agency where all of the bits of the jigsaw are sitting together. And that, I think, will do a number of things. In the report, I think that will help to reduce some of the pressures on the system, some of the bureaucracy that's in the system. As you know in the report, one of the things that I asked head teachers in both primary and secondary settings to do was to give me an indication of the number of extant policies that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. Secondary head teachers, round about 40. Primary teachers, round about 34. And complaints that not all of those policies were necessarily coherent themselves. So there's a question about where the reform actually lies. For me, it lies at all levels. And we can't have a system where different policies are either contradicting each other or working against each other or are not clear enough to be implemented, because they then go through a filter at local authority level, and some local authorities will apply their interpretation of that policy on the system. So, head teachers and teachers are saying to me, well, the government are asking me to do this. This seems to be government policy, but the local authority are asking me to do that. So I'm hoping through the creation of a national agency for Scottish education of the kind that I'm recommending, that some of those inconsistencies and some of that fragmentation will disappear. But as I also highlight in the report, it has to be much more than simply replacing SQA and reforming Education Scotland.
So, child protection. Obviously, this is with regards to your role previously with the General Teaching Council of Scotland. This will be something that will be close to you. The GTCS did make a submission where they talked about, putting words in their mouth, but the vacuum around about regulation of employers when it comes to child protection and safeguarding. They've got a role, as you know, in terms of regulating the profession, but because local authorities, employers, they're regarded as the front line in child protection, those issues are referred on, or those referrals are passed on to local authorities to deal with. But the GTCS doesn't necessarily know what happens to those referrals. And they say there's a gap in the system because nobody's regulating. And we know local authorities sometimes manage issues rather than, they manage people out rather than actually dealing with the issues head on. Not necessarily doing anything necessarily inappropriate, but there's a tendency to manage issues. So why didn't you include a recommendation on the regulation of employers in that regard within your report when the GTCS had suggested that there is a gap in the arrangements just now?
Yes, and I think you make a very valid point. I mean, there is a lot of trust required in the system, and a trust that local authorities will be upfront with the professional regulatory body, with the General Teaching Council, in reporting any issues around child protection to the regulator. GTC is a relatively small organisation, although its profile is very big. And certainly when I was there, the 8 years I was there, we simply did not have the resource to be able to monitor what was happening within individual local authorities. So there is a need for trust in the system. And you're right, local authorities sometimes do manage, particularly where there are issues of fitness to teach, not in a child protection sense, but where teachers are perhaps not performing to a standard that's expected through the professional standards. What I did do in the report was I emphasised in my consideration of what the inspectorate might do, I emphasised the important role that they can play in respect of overseeing the procedures that are in place within schools and local authorities around child protection. From memory, I only got a hard copy of the report this morning, but from memory, I specifically made reference to child protection because I was very conscious in my latter years as the Chief Executive, the child abuse inquiry and the extent to which independent schools were not part of the GTC's registration functions at that time when many of these abuses took place. But I was very conscious that the profile of child protection was very much on the rise, and rightly so. So I've included it more within an inspectorate role. I do think there is more work that needs to be done in working between GTC Scotland and the local authorities in order to impress upon them the significance of them not referring issues directly to the regulatory body. But as I say, my approach to it was to look at it more from an inspectorate point of view. And again, one of the arguments for it being an independent inspectorate, as I suggested, either a national body or an NMO, was partly because of that, the importance given to the child protection agenda.
The Children's Commissioner was quite forceful this week about the issue, particularly with regards to restraint, where we still have got problems with the profession using inappropriate restraint methods. So, I mean, how important do you think it is that the inspector does make this a significant area of work, that we do look at how the employers are dealing with these issues and how we address the restraint issues as well?
I think that it is. I mean, we can't have a system that is so dependent on trust as it is at the moment, where there are child protection issues. And I think, in fairness, in my experience as Chief Executive, most local authorities were good at coming forward, but I recognise that there was variation there. What was a bigger issue for us at the time, and it's only just been resolved by the Inner House of the Court of Session, is that we had a number of child protection issues relating to teachers where there was criminal activity, and we had difficulty in getting the intelligence that we required from Police Scotland, who were unwilling to share information, citing data protection and GDPR. We took that, in my time as Chief Executive, to the Court of Session, and in the last year, I think it was maybe in October, that case was won by the General Teaching Council for Scotland, and rightly so. I haven't kept up to speed with it, but whether Police Scotland are any more forthcoming with the kind of information that we require, well, you know better than I, Mr. Rennie. But I think it's not just about the local authorities not informing the regulator about child protection issues. There are other players in the system, and quite frankly, for Police Scotland to ask us to take out a court order at £40,000 a time every time we wanted information relating to a teacher where there was an issue of child protection was frankly absurd. And if Police Scotland has not been more forthcoming than the Inner House's decision asked them to be, then quite frankly, that's appalling.
Thank you very much.
Willie Rennie. I'm going to call Fergus Ewing, and after Fergus has completed his line of questions, it'll be Michael Mara. Fergus.
Yes, thank you, Convener, and good morning to both professors. I just wanted to pick up on something. I think it's Professor Donaldson said, that there were extant unimplemented policies of 40, I think he said, in secondary school and 34 in primary school. Have these been looked at as part of the report? And have you identified which of these policies should be implemented and which should be consigned to the dustbin of educational history, if any?
I think, Mr. Ewing, it was me that made reference to the number of policies, and it was more the volume of policy that schools are dealing with, as opposed to whether some were working well and some were working less well. The point I was trying to make was, it was highlighted by a comment that a head teacher made. I didn't include it in the report, but rather than being a leader of learning, I'm now a leader of administration. And I think that's a great sadness, because our expectation should be that head teachers are model leaders of learning in their establishment, and particularly in primary, but also in secondary. In secondary, it's still an issue, but maybe less of an issue because there's a larger senior management team in general. But it's particularly in primary, and particularly where you have a teaching head teacher who has perhaps half a day a week of relief, then having to juggle 34 policies, as that was the average figure that primary head teachers came out with and responded to me with, is a major challenge. And again, going back to the main thrust of my report, if we want to change the education system for the better, my view is that we need to focus much more significantly on learning and teaching. And where there are variations in learning and teaching, the first port of responsibility and accountability is to the head teacher. The head teacher is responsible for the overall quality of what goes on in her or his school. And if they're being overtaken by implementing policy, some of which they may find difficult to interpret, some of which individuals have said at times can contradict, whether it be government policy as a whole, or whether it be the local authorities' interpretation of government policy and who do they respond to. As I say, it was more about the volume of that policy, but there needs to be, and this starts at the level of Scottish Government and civil servants in the creation of policy. It's not just the Learning Directorate that teachers need to be responsive to. There's lots of directorates out there that, quite frankly, would benefit from engaging with each other to ensure that policies articulate and that the volume of policy isn't such that schools, local authorities and teachers drown under them, because that cannot be the purpose of policy.
Well, thanks for that answer. And it does strike a chord with what I've heard in my constituency over the years from teachers, and particularly head teachers, who complain that they're too much time doing administration and that detracts from their primary function of teaching. But what I don't get, Professor Muir, is anyone actually coming up with any specific plan to debureaucratise the system. I mean, I did note in your report that one of the opportunities you identified for the new agency, and I quote, is to declutter and streamline the middle ground in Scotland's educational landscape. And I also read, I think, at page 47 of page 109 of your report. Sounds impressive. I don't think I quite made it through to the end, if I'm being candid, but this was the point that interested me. So I stopped at paragraph 47. Sorry about that. But that's because it quoted a primary teacher who said, and I quote, "We need less agencies, more support in classrooms, smaller class sizes, more prescriptive planning, not more agencies trying to justify how busy they are." So I guess, I was very impressed by the report and its obvious care for your task and for the pupils and so on, as Mr. Manor said earlier. But where's the beef? Who is going to get to grips with this enormous bureaucracy that we have in Scotland and that you have identified? And, would it not be really incumbent on you, as the author of the report, to say how you declutter and streamline, which policies should be, if you like, suspended, removed? In other words, is it too much to ask? Is it an unfair ask, Professor Muir, that we really need somebody to lead the task of how to get teachers back to teaching and away from the administration side? And, just saying it as an aspiration, I'm afraid it just doesn't cut the mustard. And I say that with 13 years of ministerial experience, where frustration was a daily emotion suffered when one comes up against a very large bureaucracy, which sometimes appears to impede the very purposes that we are here to advance.
Firstly, Mr. Ewan, I hope you didn't get to the end of the report simply because it was a boring read. It's a riveting read right to page 109, I can assure you. And I don't think it's for one person to make that change. I think the system needs to agree to there being less bureaucracy. And when you scratch below the surface of why we have so much bureaucracy, as I've tried to suggest in my report, it partly stems from, it's not wholly as a result of, but it partly stems from how policy is created, the fragmented nature of how policy is created, the extent to which the volume of policy, as I talked about earlier, is considered to be appropriate for the system to deal with. And you're quite right. I think we do need less agencies. What I've tried to do in creating this national agency for Scottish education is to bring bits of the environment together. I think there are probably steps further down the road, but I don't think the extent of change that would be required to bring a whole host of agencies together at this point would necessarily be appropriate. I've tried to, in my report, balance what I think is feasible change at this point. But part of the thinking around the very first recommendation is let us together, everyone who has an interest, from this committee right down to right to the teaching profession itself, let's try and get a consensus about what we want to focus on. And I think it's only by doing that that you begin to strip away some of the policy and bureaucracy that does exist within the system. You're right, there are far too many agencies. There are organisations and agencies out there that some teachers are unclear as to what their role and purpose in life is. And it was interesting talking to some of the expert panel members, and Graham might want to come in on this, who thought they knew the education system well in Scotland, but it's actually an awful lot more complex than even they imagined. So, part of my balancing act in writing the report, Mr Ewan, has been to try and suggest what is feasible in the short term, but also set the direction of travel for the longer term. And as I say, I don't think it's the job of an individual to say these are the policies that are appropriate and these are the ones that aren't. I think that has to come through a discussion of where we want the education system to be over the next 20 years, and the policies then reflect that. And I think that will automatically produce a rationalisation of policies. And I think if we are very much focused on ensuring that that we focus on learners, we focus on teachers and head teachers as leaders of learning, then I think you'll get a very clear response from them as to what needs to go and what needs to stay.
Just to pick up Mr Ewing's point, I think that is one of the key roles for the Inspectorate. I was conscious as the head of the Inspectorate, part of my job, sometimes didn't make me all that popular, but is to say to ministers or to say to the profession, to act as a kind of filter. And if the Inspectorate is doing its job properly, because of the evidence that comes through the inspection programme, it's got an absolutely up-to-date knowledge of what's happening throughout Scottish schools, and can then help to deploy that knowledge, partly to address issues of policy incontinence, which can certainly happen, because if you get a very responsive policy environment, the answer to a problem is a new policy, and it's got to hit down somewhere. So I think, part of the role of an inspectorate is to provide us with that evaluation, and I think because the inspectorate was inside the development body, I think that bit of the inspectorate's role became very difficult to do. So the Chief Inspector was also the head of the development organisation. I think that role conflict that's in there maybe diluted the role of the Inspectorate in terms of helping to address the issue you're raising, Mr Ewing.
Thank you.
Just a final reflection, really. And I appreciate that I'm an outsider to the educational world and you're insider experts. So who am I to opine? Because I don't arguably have the factual knowledge. But you have said we want to declutter and streamline the middle ground. I don't quite know if you have a plan for how that could be done, other than, as Professor Donaldson just said, the Inspectorate should perhaps identify things to be culled, made more efficient and so on. But would it not be one idea to ask a group of head teachers to say, what should be dispensed with. Has that been tried? And, you know, say 5 from primary schools and secondary schools throughout the country and say, you know, what would you do to simplify and declutter the middle ground? Would that, the people who do work and who do things, in my experience, are the people who know what is wrong. The people who are, you know, with all respect, professors, MSPs, who are not in the classroom, who are not in the schools, don't know what's going on. Very often, that's in whatever walk of life. I always feel that it's the people that are doing the work that know what doesn't work. And very often they're the people who are asked for their opinions last. So I'm just putting this as maybe it's a daft laddie suggestion, but would that be something that you could add as an addendum to your recommendations, Professor Muir, perhaps?
I think, Mr. Ewing, there will be lots of volunteers coming forward from primary and secondary sector, and also from early years, to cull some of those policies. And whilst I'm not sure I could make it an addendum to the report, it's certainly something I would accord with.
Thank you. Michael Mara, I think, has one more element of questioning to follow, and then we will go to Bob Doris.
Thanks, Convener. Actually, it follows on from in a slightly similar vein. So, would the new National Education Agency, if that was put in place on the vision that you've outlined for it, Professor Muir, could we then get rid of the regional improvement collaboratives? Is that one thing that could, along the lines of Fergus Ewing's suggestion, be scrapped?
I think the regional improvement collaboratives are modelled on what's been happening in Wales, and I think they have been an attempt to try and create a more local support structure. As you know, the report on the regional improvement collaboratives that came out last year, I think, was saying that some of them seem to be working reasonably well, but others are not. You'll notice that in the report, as I said earlier, I tend to talk about regional collaboration. I think this is one of the issues that we have currently within the education system in Scotland, that regional improvement collaboratives are seen as being an entity, they are a body, whereas what I'm trying to direct it towards is the concept of regional collaboration. So in other words, provide the mechanism for support to be much more regional and localised.
Seconded staff, and so they create their own bureaucracy. And I suppose Mr. Ewing's questioning along that line about that middle ground. There's these intermediary organisations. I mean, essentially, the regional improvement collaboratives are the kind of the Rustin Hulks of a failed reform agenda from the last cabinet secretary. It was the attempt to remove control of education policy from local councils, and this was kind of what was the leftover result of that. Now, some of them, I would tend to agree. When I speak to teachers, some of them have had some value. But actually, when you're, the thing that you're describing in terms of a kind of a teacher-led kind of sharing, empowering teachers, giving them the information they need, that sounds like a little bit about where regional improvement collaboratives have worked. That's what they've got out of them. So are we not looking at another duplication there?
No, I hope not. And I mean, I think in my report, I'm very clear that one of the models I looked at, I mean, there is obviously an agreement between Scottish Government, local authorities and Education Scotland at the moment regarding regional improvement collaboratives and how they operate. But one of the things that struck me was the model for operating Public Health Scotland, which was a co-sponsorship model. And I make reference specifically to it. And you're right, I think what is needed for that regional collaboration, not RICS, but regional collaboration to work, is that they have more control of their finance, they have a longer term funding, and that the resources that currently comprise Education Scotland and the Regional Improvement Collaboratives are much more directed to supporting teachers on the ground. So that resource is being used. So it's more a kind of co-sponsorship model, which is why I was attracted to the Public Health Scotland model, which is a slightly different model to what exists just now in terms of the infrastructure of RICS.
I think you're reflecting on some of that policy landscape as well. I mean, it's a very busy place. I asked SPICE, the Scottish Parliament Information Centre, to give me a number of the working groups. There were a total of the number of working groups the Scottish Government had set up for education, and they were unable to do so. The answer was loads. It was so many, they were unable to count them. They weren't able to track down. I mean, we see in kind of the announcements we get in the Chamber, whether reference to your own commission of work, each statement the Scottish Cabinet Secretary gives, there seems to be another 3 or 4 kind of crop up, and groups to be. And all of these bodies then produce the kind of policies that we end up talking about. So I have an issue then about, I think, what you identify in the report as section 13 regarding, I suppose, kind of transition. The transition period between where we are now to where we have to get to. And I worry about pace in this. And I understand what you have identified in there in terms of the twin track approach and making sure there's an agency that sits alongside the other one. But we have really urgent problems in Scottish education now. So we have, the biggest attainment gap we've ever had. We have the lowest attainment in primary school pupils, and we have no assessment that's been made of the impact of the pandemic on the rest of our education system. Complete refusal so far from the government to actually do that work. But international evidence seems to suggest that it's very, very difficult situation, and that's what we're hearing from teachers. So are we changing quickly enough to actually address the real problems that we have now in the system?
I think from a school point of view, and particularly a secondary point of view, one of the big challenges is around the national qualifications. And as you know, Professor Hayward from Glasgow is going to be doing some work on the review of national qualifications. I think that's absolutely essential. Certainly speaking to the FE sector, the review of higher national provision is something that has been delayed. It's one of the reasons why there's a view out there that some of the vocational qualifications that SQA offer are out of date, and one of the reasons why colleges are looking to other providers of qualifications as opposed to SQA. Yes, there are a lot of policies out there. I don't doubt it. I think it goes back to something that Graham hinted at in one of his responses, Mr. Mara, and that is that characterising Scottish education just now is it tends to be a very reactive system that we've got. What we don't have is the kind of thing that Graham referred to in his Japanese experience. We don't really have a programme of monitoring and review in the sense that yourselves as Education and Skills Committee and government generally can get feedback on how well things are working or not working. So I think all of that to me has to be in the mix of what do we want the education system to look like, and how do we then support that? What is the infrastructure that we create round about it that produces a much more forward-looking and reflective education system that doesn't wait for crisis to come along, that doesn't wait for a policy to address an issue or to address a crisis. And there always will be crises, and it's inevitable that governments and local authorities need to respond to those. But one of the very clear views I've had for some time, and it came through and confirmed by those that I spoke with, is that we're in that reactive mode far too much. And that's what sometimes adds to the stress. That's what adds to the bureaucracy. There's a crisis, so this is the response, and all of a sudden schools are local authorities are having to respond to another policy or another suite of policies to address that issue. So trying to get to a system, and I would hope that this would be part of the outcome of a national conversation, is a recognition that because of the pace of change in education, which has been significant, and it's going to be more significant over the next 20 years, as Graham hinted at, we need to have a mechanism, we need to have an infrastructure that is much more on the front foot and is ahead of the curve, and not simply responding with all of the fallout that a responsive system then produces.
We are looking at 3 years before we get into a new settled pattern. And those young people who are going through the system at the moment, aren't going to see the benefit of those changes. I mean, if you reflect on what happened in the last couple of weeks, the study guides that were produced by the SQA described, I think, reasonably memorably to me by a geography teacher in Glasgow as the Mariana Trench of uselessness. I mean, this is an organisation that is failing now, rather than, and so you'll understand, and I get where you're pitching the long term, and I absolutely agree with that, the need for strategic intent. But there's also the need for short term leadership, isn't there?
Yes, there is, and I would hope that the government would look at what I have recommended in the 21 recommendations and identify those that can go forward quickly. Because you're right, there are issues in the system at the moment. I think that I think the timescale, the 4-year timescale to after Diet 2024, for some of the areas that we need to respond to, probably is too long a timescale. I think you're right. I think there are things that need to be addressed in the system just now, and I would be as keen as anyone to see a very clear plan that sets out how, in the short term, some of these can be taken forward to deal with some of the very real issues and the challenges that have emerged, particularly in the last 2 years.
That's really useful. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Michael Mara. Bob Doris.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning to both of you. This has been really helpful so far. I wanted to raise an area where I think there's probably broad consensus on, and that's in relation to recommendations around the reform of inspections. Now, I know some colleagues will have some general questions in relation to this, but I want to specifically look at early learning and childcare and reform of inspections process there. It's widely agreed, I think, that the sector is disproportionately assessed and that it could be far more efficient. I know there's a recommendation for Professor Muir who says there should be a shared inspections framework between the new inspectorate body and the care inspectorate. Now, given the fact there's over 8,000 registered early learning and childcare services in Scotland and over 200,000 young people there, it's obvious to see how bureaucracy in assessment and inspection could be burdensome. So a very specific question on that. Education Scotland says on its website they already have examples where standalone childcare facilities will have a care inspectorate representative on their inspection team from time to time. So I'm keen to know what a shared inspection framework would look like and whether it would be inspecting once and comprehensively rather than returning again and again to early year settings.
I think you touch, Mr Doig, on an issue that came through very strongly from the early learning and childcare sector, and that is the extent to which they, as you say, are disproportionately, it was a word I used in the report, disproportionately subject to inspection by both bodies. If I can maybe just respond by giving an example of where policy doesn't always align. The Care Inspectorate last year produced a new inspection framework at a time when, prior to COVID, they were working on a shared inspection framework. The notion of a shared inspection framework was that it would be a single inspection and it would be a single inspection activity. Now, how the Care Inspectorate were ever allowed to create a new inspection framework at a time when they were meant to be working with Education Scotland on a shared inspection framework, I find quite bamboozling, to be honest. And particularly at a time when the early learning and childcare sector is working hard across the board in the independent as well as in the other settings to embed the 1140 hours. So I actually think it's one of the recommendations that I was quite tentative on, because I was very conscious, as I said earlier, Mr Doig, that I had to be mindful of what was happening in the wider firmament, and that includes the National Care Service outcomes and how that might impact on the work of the Care Inspectorate. I didn't go as far as saying that it should be undertaken by the Education Inspectorate, but personally that is my view. But there is a statutory function that the Care Inspectorate undertakes, so that would require, and it's one of the reasons, Mr Marrow, why there sometimes are delays, as you well know, that some of the statute requires to be amended. But I do think that the work that's done in early learning and childcare, subject to as much inspection as has been the case, is not sustainable, and it's not sustainable for the very reasons that you cite. I think also the early learning and childcare has to be seen as part of, I think, a kind of re-envisaging the education system, has to be seen as being a key player in the system. It worries me at times, and it did when I was an inspector, when primary and secondary teachers seemed to value less what was happening from the years 0 to 5, and they only really started learning when they came into the primary school. I think we all know, and the research shows, that the 6 most important years in a young person's life is up to the age of 5, and that actually starts the learner journey. And I think the profile of early learning and childcare, I think would like to see enhanced significantly in any re-envisaging of a vision for education going forward. So you're right, I think the reform of inspection should look very, very closely at what can be done to lessen the burden and unnecessary inspection, dare I say. And obviously, there are models there, risk-based models and so on, that can be applied so that early learning and childcare centres can get on with the job that they're being expected to do, and not have to respond sometimes twice a year to inspections coming down the road, because they're all taken very seriously, and they do create a lot of disruption to the flow of learning, and that's just the reality of it.
That's helpful. Just a relatively brief, hopefully, follow-up question. I think it came through quite strongly in the report. You're surprised that the Care Inspectorate produced their own revised framework when they were supposed to be working collaboratively with Education Scotland, and I'll leave that sitting there about why that would be the case. But you seem to be quite clear about a shared inspection framework. It would be integrated, it would be combined, it would be seamless, and it would be an inspect once process. So the skills mix would have to be appropriate in relation to that supportive inspection regime. You said there that you probably favoured the new inspectorate body in the education side of things leading on that, and you also acknowledged the need for legislative changes because there's a statutory duties in relation to inspections of early learning and childcare settings. So that's helpful, and the government will bring forward its proposals on this before the summer, is my understanding. Can I ask, would it be possible to leave it open so that as long as a lead agency does that combined inspection, be that the new Education Inspectorate or the Care Inspectorate, as long as you have a multidisciplinary team going into the establishment with the appropriate skills mix, you could have a joint statutory duty in relation to that? Because I think practitioners would care whether it's the new Education Inspectorate or whether it's the Care Inspectorate. They want it to be proportionate, they want it to be supportive, and they don't want it to be bureaucratic. So any additional thoughts in relation to that, and any thoughts in relation to the Scottish Government timescale, or details are likely to emerge before the summer?
The kind of model that you're suggesting, Mr Doig, is very much what I have in mind, and one of the reasons why I suggested that it resided within the Education Inspectorate is that it has a long history of having multidisciplinary teams inspecting all manner of educational establishments. And you're right, the critical thing is that the expertise and the credibility of those who are undertaking the inspection is something that's recognised by those that are on the receiving end of an inspection. So I think the kind of model that you're suggesting there is very much at the heart of it. As to what that model might look like and that joint inspection framework might look like, my engagements with folk in early learning and childcare make it very clear they have a good understanding of what they are trying to do. And it goes back to that basic point in my report that we need to start and recognise better the expertise that resides within the sectors of education that we have, and use that to support inspection frameworks or support policy and changes to policy, much more so than we do at the moment.
And the summer timescale, would that be reasonable?
Well, I do think that, looking at all of my recommendations, I do think that an early move on the creation of the independent inspectorate body is something that can be done very quickly. And again, I don't know if Graham, he's much more experienced in the inspection activities than I, but I certainly saw that, and bearing in mind that some of the discussions we had amongst the expert panel, I think it was felt very strongly that that is something that could be moved on very quickly. Going back to Mr Mara's point about the pace of some of the changes, I do think there are things that can be done very quickly, and I think that is one of them.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I would echo that. I was slightly surprised at the government's response. I thought they would move quickly on taking inspection out of Education Scotland, because that's something you could do quickly. And then, picking up Mr Mara's point, that now independent external entity can be part of the engine that's driving change and asking hard questions of the process as it goes through. So I think there is a case for that. Just a wee word of caution on the early years stuff, because I was head of the inspectorate when we introduced early years inspection, which wasn't the case previously. There is a distinction between regulation and inspection. So what's called a care inspector, it's a regulator. And it's dealing with important issues to do with infection control. There's all sorts of stuff that a regulator's got to do that requires a frequency of visit you don't need when you're looking at the broader educational experience of young people. So it's soluble, but it's complex. And I think something around the multidisciplinary teams with perhaps visits to top up the regulation side rather than a big inspection, set-piece inspection, would be a possibility. But I think that distinction between a regulator and an inspector is quite an important one.
Kokab Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. I've been listening with great interest all morning. A lot of what you have said so far certainly resonates from my experience and the teachers that I speak to. I welcome the fact that mainstreaming of the learner voice throughout the educational landscape is at the heart of this, and it's something that I know that teachers and parents have wanted that for a long time, and we don't always see it. I want to go carry on with inspections and just open that up a wee bit. Currently, and having been through inspections, declare an interest there, the process can be, and often is, very stressful and can cause enormous anxiety and extra burdens on schools, parents and pupils as well. So how do you think that the school inspection system can be more supportive of ongoing quality improvement? Not just an event that happens that, you put everything into it and then you recover from it, but how does it become more integral to that?
I think to some extent the work that has been done over a number of years, and Graham introduced this when he was a senior chief, was to have the inspectorate bring on associate assessors, so practitioners from the system, who are trained by HMI and who accompany, after a period of probation, who accompany inspectors on inspection, not within their own local authority area, but more widely. I think extending that opportunity to see inspectors in operation is, and I know from speaking to many associate assessors, one of the best professional learning exercises that they can undertake. So I think there's something about having an inspection process that actively encourages the involvement of practitioners from the system, whether it be head teachers or, dare I say, local authority officials, as well as practising teachers themselves. And we certainly found that in my time in the inspectorate, I'm sure it's the same with Graham, to be a very positive way of sharing standards, but also a very positive way of reassuring the rest of the system that inspectors were empathetic, they understood, they always set the context of the inspection in the context of the school. So I think there are things like that that can be done. The sharing of good practice, again, looking back over the years, we had a series of reports every 3 years, the Improving Scottish Education reports, which set out examples of good practice that teachers and head teachers could look at, and these reports were very much twofold in terms of what they did, as well as sharing good practice. They helped to identify what Graham touched on earlier. What are some of the issues that need to be resolved within education? So they became a really important driver for policy change. And as I said earlier, coming from an independent body that is held in trust and has the confidence of teachers and wider society, it's a good way in which policy can be informed by what is happening on the ground. And as inspectors, we were very up to speed with what was happening on the research front, although again I think there's more that could probably be done in looking at researching what's happening out there, going back to Mr Marra's point earlier about how we know whether things are working well and the timescale over which that happens. I mean, I do see, and it's part of my thinking within the creation of the National Agency for Scottish Education, the notion that it would have a responsibility for bringing together the kind of think tank thinking that exists out there in the system, as well as, and possibly even commissioning research in areas that are being identified as not working as well as they might, or looking at what's coming over the horizon and how we prepare for that in advance. So I think there are a number of things that are in the system just now, Mr Stewart, that could be replicated or could be enhanced in order to remove some of the fear factor about inspection. The bottom line is, of course, that folk would rather not be inspected than be inspected. But I think what that then comes down to is who the inspectors are and how they operate. And I think even in my time there, and Graham may have more to say on this, I think we worked very hard to appoint the right folk to the role of an inspector. I used the word empathy there because we were both involved in a lot of interviewing of inspectors, and for me that was one of the qualities that I looked for. Somebody who could go in to sometimes quite a challenging context and empathise with them and put themselves in the shoes of the head teacher, or yourself as a former teacher, or Mr Doig as a former teacher. I don't know, Graham, if there are other things that you might want to suggest.
Yeah, no, I think, broadly, I obviously agree with that. The challenge, good inspection, there's always going to be a degree of stress. I mean, any of us, if somebody's coming in from the outside, it creates a degree of stress. So that's going to happen, but it shouldn't be oppressive. And I think it's when inspection becomes oppressive, then everyone freezes, and it all becomes about, how do we get these folk off our backs, kind of. So the more you can create a context within which inspection is moving towards being done with rather than to, the more likely you are to actually improve things for children. Because the more oppressive it is, the more people are trying to hide their problems, they're trying to hide what's working. The more you can actually create a context within which this is somebody coming in from the outside who's got a lot of expertise from having seen lots of stuff elsewhere, or as a fellow professional, in actually teaching at the time, giving you a view which can be combined with your own internal evaluation, your own assessment of what's needed. Good inspection doesn't tell you that there's a problem. It will do, obviously, there's a problem, but good inspection heads problems off. If inspection is working well, it's identifying things that are emerging rather than telling the blindingly obvious afterwards and saying this is not working. There is and Ken quoted it in the report. I was asked to undertake a review of the inspectorate in Wales, Eston. Now, Eston was a very quasi-Ofsted type inspection. It was very external, very heavily driven. But the report I put in, which was called a learning inspectorate, was designed to turn that on its head and say inspections about learning, inspectors need to learn, we should see the inspection process as a learning process. And actually, Eston have completely changed their approach to inspection and have adopted that, which is much more in tune with the kind of reform that's taking place in Wales just now. So one of the questions, I think, big questions when this new independent inspectorate is set up, is, get the culture right from the start. So whoever's heading it up is going to have a very, very good strategic understanding of the role that inspection can and should play in helping kids to get the best possible deal in Scottish schools, because that's what inspection's for.
Yeah, no, I agree with a lot of what you've said there, especially the makeup of the inspectors. I do think, to have the credibility amongst the workforce, sort of being mindful of people who haven't been out of the classroom for too long, because it is actually quite easy to forget what it's actually like and retain that connection. So mainstreaming learners' voice and wanting to put learners and teachers at the heart of everything. I'm looking at a quote from a child as well. I think if students had an opportunity to be involved in inspections, it would look a lot different. So I'm just wanting to explore that. How can we incorporate that in an inspection system? Is there scope for young people to be co-designing an inspection system or the remit of it in the future?
Absolutely, there is. And I think, to some extent, there is a degree of involvement of children and young people in inspections at the moment. There's the questionnaires that go out. Inspectors take groups of children and young people and have discussions with them and so on. But you're right, and it goes back to, you're really making a case, Ms Stewart, for recommendation 1. I think all of that is part of the kind of discussion that we need to have about the entirety of the education system. As Graham says, we want, if we want an inspectorate and recognise that there is value in having an inspectorate, then how do we want it to operate? And who is it for? And I think bringing in the voice, as you say, of children and young people is critical to it. And of course, we have looming over the horizon the UNCRC incorporation. I talk a lot in my report about culture and mindset shift. I think that in itself, the UNCRC being embedded in schools, and there are already some strong moves in rights respecting schools in Scotland, but that's going to call into question how teachers operate, their own values, and how they engage with children and young people. But it's also going to ask the question: they are the users of the education service, so what do they want from it themselves? And I think some of the comments, as I said earlier, I think some of the comments that have come through, the wider comments that don't appear in my report, but appear in the report that was produced by Cathy McCulloch and her colleagues at the Children's Parliament and so on, are fascinating. Some of them are very reassuring, but some of them are deeply worrying as well. And in a sense, that is part of the reason why I think we need to take this window of opportunity to review what we want the system to look like for the next generation.
Yeah, it is a big area to explore there. Just a final question. So while school inspectors will assess schools, and you're recommending that they be completely independent, who inspects the inspectors?
I'll pass to Graham on that one. He's got much more experience than I have on that.
Yes, well, I mean, inspection, the integrity of inspection has to do with its credibility. So in a sense, inspectors are inspected by the extent to which they are actually having a positive impact on Scottish education. Of course, the Parliament here and ministers will be looking at how well the inspectorate is fulfilling the functions that have been set for it. So I think there is a role, and it's interesting in Ken's report talking about whether or not the inspectorate should report to the Parliament. Should have that kind of role rather than. There's pros and cons in relation to that, which obviously need to be talked through. But I think fundamentally inspection operates in the public arena, and they are responsible to you. They are responsible to to the Parliament at the end of the day in terms of the role they are playing in Scottish education. I think that it has been, my own personal view, and I suppose I would say this, but I think over the course of the last 10 years, there has been an absence of that kind of external commentary on how Scottish education has been performing. I'm certainly not been aware of it, and I think it's very important that we have that, because if you don't have that, you get evaluation by who shouts the loudest or evaluation by anecdote. We need something that is systematic, built in, and is just consistently providing that kind of reflection back to the system. And if inspectors don't do that well, you'll have to tell them.
I'm sure we will. Convener, thank you.
Ross Greer.
Thanks very much. Convener, I found this conversation around the inspectorate really interesting, particularly the questions a moment ago around who the inspector should be. Now, given what's just been said there and some of the remarks in your report, Professor Muir, around the need to make greater use of peer review processes and for inspectors to have recent first-hand classroom experience, does that not all point towards a system whereby the ideal inspectorate is one largely staffed by teachers who are on a 3-year or a 5-year secondment, something like that? Because you can't, by the very nature, if you want to continuously have people with very recent classroom experience, you cannot have people in post as inspectors for a particularly long period of time, because it gets further and further away from the last time they were in the classroom. Does that not just lead to, and I'm saying, I think this is an attractive proposal, does that not lead to a place of saying, well, the inspectorate should be seconded teachers on short-term contracts?
To a degree, I think we've moved towards that with the introduction of associate assessors. As I said earlier, bringing them in. I think at the same time, though, there is an issue about continuity of experience. Certainly, I was 18 years in the inspectorate, and I learned a lot in that time. I think sharing that longer-term experience through the permanency of my role as a full-time permanent inspector benefited those associate assessors. But I think the mix that you're suggesting, that there's a bit of that already. As I said earlier, I think the balance needs to be much more towards bringing on folk from the system itself into inspection activity. It doesn't necessarily mean that an inspector, all inspectors need to be on a 3 or a 5 year term, but because I do think there are benefits in having part of that cohort who are longer term and who see patterns of change and so on, because as I was suggesting through the Improving Scottish Education reports, it's not just about change over a few years. It's about how changes it takes place over a longer period. So I think you need a degree of continuity. But I think the principle that you're suggesting in the balance is not far off what an ideal inspectorate would look like.
Thanks. And Professor Donaldson, do you have any thoughts on that, on the inspectorate workforce makeup?
I think, as Ken says, it is about balance. I would have to say, in my experience, some very good teachers make very poor inspectors. Inspection is in a sense a profession which grows out of the teaching profession, but it has its own set of skills. It's about evidence. It's about not saying, "I'm watching you teach, and I wouldn't have taught that way. Therefore, you're not good." It's not. So, in some ways, what a good inspector does is to understand the context that they're dealing with, to be looking for evidence, to be engaging very heavily with the young people, and to be working, in a genuinely collaborative way with whoever it is in the school that they're dealing with. So I think you've got to get the balance right. I think that teams that are made up of somebody who is a skilled evaluator, because that's what you're talking about, and can help to work with leading professionals that are brought in, getting that balance right, seems to me to be the model, and that's very close to the model which Scotland certainly was developing towards some time ago.
Thanks. And if considering the current roles of the inspectorate, are there elements of that, elements of the inspection process that would perhaps be better suited moving to, say, regional improvement collaboratives or even local authorities themselves and conducted entirely through a peer review process? So not through teachers who are seconded to become inspectors or inspectors have come in through some other way, but are removed from the inspection process and taken into a purely peer review space. Are there any specific areas that you think that would be more appropriate for?
I mean, I think that the notion of having peer review as being kind of just the way we do the job, you know, that the peer review is an integral working, you know, seeing each other, seeing different schools in different contexts as part of the normal way of doing things is a very important way. I mean, part of the problem, and you know, I've seen this many times, is that the better people know each other, the more difficult it is to actually engage in evaluative discussions. You know, you've got to be, the notion of a critical friend is actually quite a hard role to play. And the friend bit sometimes trumps the critical bit, you know, in terms of those honest conversations. So there is a definite skill to being able to win the confidence of the people you're dealing with. But you're there for the children. And one of the peer review issues is it can be a process which is about teachers rather than about children, ironically, you know, given that everyone's a teacher. So as I say, it's quite a complex issue. It's about getting the balance right, and it's about creating a culture which is about evidence, which is about, I mean, it sounds a bit trite, but certainly my view, as if I was asked, who are my reference point? Who am I inspecting for? It's the children. I'm not inspecting for ministers. I'm not inspecting for the Parliament. I'm not inspecting for teachers in the profession. If necessary, and the evidence points in that direction, hard messages have to be given to any of those groups. So peer review should just be part of how we do things. But in addition to that, you need something which is helping to provide an external perspective, that kind of distance from the day-to-day stuff, which allows you to sometimes spot things that haven't been spotted. I've sometimes been really surprised I wouldn't name them, but some schools which I've been horrified at what was happening in that school. And yet the local authority either condoned it or didn't do anything about it. Now, how could that happen? And it took that external coming in from the outside to actually say, this is not right, this can't go on. So it is a question of balance, and I think in creating the new inspectorate, exactly the kind of issues you're raising need to be discussed, you know, about the strategy that the role inspection is going to play in the system. My own view is I wouldn't have inspectors grading schools. That was my recommendation to the inspectorate in Wales when they have dropped the grading, because I think the inspection then becomes all about the grade, not about the children and the learning from the process.
Thanks very much. And Professor Muir, I think that there's a really quite challenging question that you raise in this section of the report in relation to who the inspectorate are accountable to. Is it Parliament? Is it government? Is it some mix of the two? And from my reading of it, and do correct me if I've totally misinterpreted what you meant, but my reading of it is that your intention is much more about direct parliamentary accountability in the same way that some of the commissioners who are appointed by Parliament are. My question there would be about is there not a need to some extent for government to set strategic direction? So, for example, the process that we've gone through in recent years around embedding LGBT inclusive education and LGBT inclusive practices in all schools. Is the inspectorate not exactly the kind of body that we would want ensuring that something like that had indeed been implemented, and therefore there's a need for government to set strategic direction to say to the inspectorate, for the next 5 years, it's really important that this is part of your inspection programme because we've set this as a priority for all schools with no exceptions?
Much, Mr. Greer, and you know the inspectors inspect in that context because that is what is expected of schools. And one of the ways in which, certainly in my time and in Graham's time, we did that was by undertaking not school inspections or establishment inspections, but thematic inspections. So I think back to, when we talked earlier about child protection, thematic inspections on child protection in particular areas of concern, although it's part and parcel, or was part and parcel of the inspection process anyway. Thematic inspections of teacher education. So the kind of strategic policy areas that are set by ministers very much could be part of such an inspection, and it would simply then be dependent on the arrangements for the governance of the new inspectorate body as to what ministers could ask of that inspectorate. I mean, at the moment, for example, the inspectorate don't inspect initial teacher education. It comes as a request from ministers to undertake a thematic review of teacher education. So the same could be applied to any of those strategic policy areas.
If the intention is for the inspectorate to still have its strategic direction set in some respects by government, how different a governance structure are you envisaging? Therefore, particularly the points that you make around direct accountability to Parliament, what are you looking for in terms of inspectorate accountability that's not in place as part of the current model?
What I was trying to do, Mr Gearan, suggesting that it was a non-ministerial office or a national body, was to make the new inspectorate, let's call it, part of the building of the trust and confidence in the education system. Because I think it has waned, as I said, in one of my earlier answers. So what I was trying to do there was to say that the system as a whole and the stakeholders in the system have a body there that they know, as Graham said earlier, is talking truth to power. Without fear or favour, it's delivering hard messages where it needs to deliver hard messages. And my feeling was that those public body options that I looked at, the non-ministerial office or a public body or a national body, gave it that degree of separation from the system, but it also gave it a degree of credibility. Now, I know it has to gain credibility, but it gave a degree of reassurance to stakeholders and users of the system that this was a body that operated in a particular way and folk could have confidence or more confidence given that degree of separation.
Thanks very much, and thank you both. That's all from me for now, Convener.
Thank you, Ross Greer. Oliver Mundell. Oh yeah, we're not going to have the privilege of seeing Oliver because he's got a broadband problem, so we're going to hear him only.
Thank you, Convener. Can you hear me okay now?
Hear you clearly.
I wanted to just go back briefly to the SQA. Obviously, Professor Muir has said there's obvious problems or problems starting to become visible in the SQA before COVID. Does he think then it sort of undermines some of the trust within Scottish education when you then have the person sort of responsible for ministerial oversight, continuing to say that they have full confidence in that organisation, right up until June 2021?
Yeah, I think, as Graham said in one of his responses, Mr Mundell, the creation of, or the work of an examination and qualifications body is particularly challenging. And I think it's inevitable that from time to time they either don't get things right or they're perceived not to get things right. I think that they've been subject to a lot of scrutiny, and rightly so. And I think what has emerged has been the decision that they should be replaced simply because they have lost a degree of, or in part, they've lost a degree of trust and confidence in that particular body. I think it is, as I say, a real challenge for any examination and qualifications body to maintain full confidence during a period of what has been significant change for it, and has had to be very responsive to the challenges that it's had to face. I think part of what my proposals are trying to do is to go some way towards rebuilding some of the trust and confidence that has been lost, not only in SQA but more generally, I think, across the board. as how we've come to grapple with some of the challenges that we've faced, not just in the last couple of years, but as I said earlier in one of my responses, I don't know if you heard it or not, but the introduction of the national qualifications a number of years ago, not being seen to be delivering on the philosophy of Curriculum for Excellence, which was what the intention was. And although SQA, I'm sure, would say that they have attempted to ensure that the national qualifications do accord with that philosophy, the very firm view out there in the system is that they don't, hence the call for a review of the NQs by the Cabinet Secretary.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying and respect the answer, but I think that the challenge is, we've had problems for years. I mean, the predecessor committee to this in the last Parliament, raised concerns about the independence of the inspectorate. We've had concerns repeated, over and over again about the SQA. Lots of the problems you identify are well known amongst the teaching profession. It's just how we have confidence, that the government is actually going to take these things forward, and build that trust when they've spent years trying to say that everything was okay, that these weren't real problems, and everything could just be sorted, if only people ask less difficult questions. Do you have confidence that they've taken?
I didn't hear that last point, Mr. Mundell. Sorry.
Can you repeat the last question, Oliver?
Do you have confidence that they've taken the message on board? And should it have taken, should it have taken an OECD review and a review from yourself for them to actually recognise what are significant issues?
Well, no, I don't think it should have. And as I said earlier, I think one of the values of my report and the reports that were issued that accompany my report is that SQA uses them as a mirror to reflect on how they plan to go forward, given that they have been given a stay of execution for until 2024. And I think I've made it clear that with some degree of urgency, they need to reflect on these three areas that I talk about in the report: the governance of the organisation, the leadership and the culture. And I would hope that they would do that in prompt fashion, for the very reasons that we've discussed throughout all of this, that these are children and young people who are being most affected by the changes that are taking place in the education system and in society more generally. And we need a qualifications and examination body that has the confidence, that commands the confidence of everybody that uses it, particularly the learners.
I think the point I'm trying to tease out is that there's also a cultural issue among Scottish Government ministers who've exercised very poor oversight over those bodies, and I think it's wrong to just try and shift all of the buck onto the SQA, as dreadful as they've been. Surely Scottish Government ministers should have identified sooner that something was going wrong in a system that was working well. Is there not accountability and cultural issues there?
Well, Scottish ministers are accountable to committees like this. So I have to say that, I didn't feel that it was an area that I could refer to directly in my report. I think what I've tried to do is to identify where I think that there are issues, and clearly, if MSPs feel that the SQA needs to be held to account, then there are mechanisms for doing that, including through this particular committee.
Yes, yeah, I think that gets to the kind of hub of the issue. We've brought in the OECD, to work to a very restricted remit, and then the Scottish Government have brought in yourself, and neither group have really felt able to challenge the culture at the heart of the Scottish Government, and the lack of ministerial oversight that's allowed the issues you've identified to continue on for 5 years, when opposition parties across the Parliament have been calling for an independent inspectorate. Opposition parties have raised concerns about leadership at the SQA, and we've seen continued reboots of curriculum for excellence, but nothing actually seems to have changed, and it's just what makes you confident that this time is going to be any different?
Well, what I've tried to do in my report, Mr Mundell, is to set out a number of recommendations that I think will drive that change, and it's for everybody at all levels in the system, from ministers right the way through to teachers in schools, to consider those recommendations and to find a way forward, which is why I think the next step has to be that consideration of, or a conversation around, what we want the education system to look like.
And does that not take it back to the start, before the OECD report, before your own report, which I guess in some respects have already set us off in a direction? Would it not, be more of a genuine offer to teachers and to frontline practitioners to say, we value your input from the start, rather than putting so many pieces in place and then saying, now we need to have a conversation?
Well, that's one of the reasons why, when I said in my opening statement that I had engaged in a very extensive round of engagements with all of the stakeholders in the education system, and I would hope that would be replicated when the national conversation takes place, hopefully promptly with a degree of urgency.
Okay. I'll leave it there, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver Mundell. And our final question is from Stephanie Callaghan.
Thank you, Convener, and thanks for joining us today. I know it's been quite a long session, but I do have a few questions for you here. First of all, we have mentioned council leaders and directors of education, and I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more around how you envisage the role of local authorities fitting with a proposed national agency to really support and drive improvement at local and regional level, and whether, how important are clusters, collaboration, the kind of sense of shared identity and support and work through schools there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ms Callaghan. I mean, I'll maybe refer back to what I said earlier about my thinking around regional collaboration. I think we have a system just now where many teachers see regional improvement collaboratives as individual bodies and entities. And what I'm trying to suggest within my report is that the resourcing that is applied both from local authorities and from the central agency, the Education Scotland, is something that is reconfigured so that there is more local and regional control over the agenda and also over the financing. One of the criticisms that I got back from local authorities around the funding of the Regional Improvement Collaboratives was that it was one-year funding. That seemed to limit quite significantly the extent to which they could offer longer-term support where they felt that was necessary because there were uncertainties about where future funding was going to come from. So the bottom line is local authorities have a statutory responsibility to effect improvement in their education system and support change in their education system. They are responsible for it. So in the agency that I'm proposing, I would hope and I would expect a closer collaboration more consistently across the country between the local authorities and the national agency than perhaps has been the case so far. And we can't have a system, as was reported to me, where support is on the basis of who you know, either in the local authority or in the support agency, in this case Education Scotland. It needs to be something, as I said earlier, that is driven much more from the bottom up, from teachers who say, in order to deliver high quality learning and teaching, this is what I need. And then the mechanism and the infrastructure is there for that to happen. So it's a much more, as I say, bespoke and responsive system than certainly seems to be the case for some at the moment. And I have to caveat that by saying that clearly there are a number of schools and teachers out there who get very good support from a collaboration between the local authority and Education Scotland. But it needs to be one that is more equitable than it would appear to be at the moment.
So there are some good examples of that just now, really, that we could be building upon then. And I do have to say, actually, I'm a councillor at South Lanarkshire Council at the moment, so just to put that out there and declare that interest. So there are some good examples to build on then, would you say?
Absolutely, and I think that came through to some extent the report on the regional improvement collaboratives. It's come through other reports, one that Glasgow University did recently on the West Partnership. You know, there are isolated examples, and when you scratch below the surface as to why they are working well, which is something that I did, you tend to find that there is a commitment from all parties, which is important. And I know that the birth of regional improvement collaboratives in some local authority areas wasn't without its difficulties, and there were varying degrees of commitment from all parties to make it work. But I think the concept of regional and local collaboration has to be the way forward, and it's the only way in which teachers can have the confidence that their needs would be responded to in a bespoke way, as opposed to some kind of national or regional improvement collaborative offer that doesn't necessarily meet the needs of, you know, a hard-pressed P5 teacher in a particular primary school.
That's great, thank you. That kind of brings me on to my next question, actually, there. You've spoken about the national agency, the need for it to be responsive and be reactive. You know, looking again at the role of the regional improvement collaboration there. So priorities for creating that ongoing collaborative environment, I'm wondering what those are, you know, that allows the local authorities, the teachers, the parents, and most of all our young people, including our young people who've got additional support needs in that as well, because there's quite a big proportion of that, you know, how we can actually look at maximising their influence, if you like, and also ensuring that wellbeing and rights are right at the centre, at a really central focus too. Thanks.
I think there are two factors that need to be in place to make all of that work, because what you're illustrating there, Ms Callahan, is the kind of model that I think the system would want to have. And I think there are two factors that are critically important in that. One is about control and one is about resource. And the two are related to each other. But part of my thinking with the national agency, and as I talked about earlier, the co-sponsorship model that's applied to Public Health Scotland, is a sense that there is, and I think in reality there is, more control and more effective use of resource to provide support at the local level than might be the case at the moment. So I think having a control of the agenda, not necessarily creating voluminous regional improvement collaborative plans centrally, but having a control of the agenda that reflects local and regional needs, and having a control of the resource, or a greater control of the resource, and you know, fundamentally that is about staffing and finance, I think means that the needs of young people and the needs of teachers are more appropriately responded to in a proactive way, as opposed to the worst practice that's out there that's reflected in some of the feedback around regional improvement collaboratives at the moment. But having said that, as I say, there is some very good practice out there from regional improvement collaboratives, and we really need to build on those. But as I say, scratching below the surface of what is working well, it is where there is commitment, it's where they feel that there is a degree of empowerment over the agenda, and that adequate resource is being applied to make it work.
Thanks. That's really, really helpful. And just a short question to finish off there. And I wouldn't mind us going to both of you if we could. I'm wondering what your top ask of us as politicians would be really to help facilitate the positive changes that our young people need and deserve.
Well, maybe I'll start and then give Graham time to think about that one. I actually think that there is a lot of really good stuff happens in Scottish schools, and I don't think it's reflected in what goes out there into the public domain. It's been a particular thing that I've been in my bonnet for a number of years, that mostly what you hear out there in the system is more negative than positive. And, you know, all of you know yourselves, having visited schools and so on, there's some wonderful stuff happens out there. So in whatever way, Convener, you and your committee can extol the virtues of the positive things happening in education in Scotland, I think we go a long way towards helping move the system forward in a positive way, because it isn't a system that's broken. It's a system that should have enough confidence to look forward and build on the very good practice that does exist out there, but make it more available and more apparent and more translatable across the board, so that all young people can benefit from it. So that would be my take on it, Ms Callaghan.
Great, couldn't agree more. And if I could ask the same question to Professor Donaldson as well, please.
Yeah, I think, you know, the benefit of my great age, that in the early years of the Parliament, it was interesting the extent to which parliamentarians had a kind of common sense of purpose, which actually the education debate that we talked about earlier reflected. And I mean, my hope would be that as we move forward, that we can re-establish not a kind of cosy consensus, but that kind of constructive engagement around the issues that really matter for the young people, and fond hope, but try to keep the politics as confined as you can, because we really do need. This is something that I really feel very strongly about. I do think we are, not just in Scotland, I mean across the world. We're at one of those points where the nature of what happens in our schools and how our young people learn is going to change very dramatically over the course of the next 5, 10, 15 years. It's going to be driven by all sorts of different forces that are disrupting previous assumptions that we had about what was the right thing to do and what, you know, where we thought we could predict the future a bit better. And I think it's just so important that we have within the Parliament a really constructive engagement with that longer-term strategic thinking about how Scotland can grow and develop and flourish, and how our young people can grow and develop and flourish in what's going to be, you know, quite a febrile world that they are living in and will live in, and of course they are our future leaders. So I think my plea would be as strategic as possible. Don't micromanage. Be as strategic as possible.
Fantastic, thank you. And I certainly hope our committee can really get that positive message out there. Thank you both. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Stephanie Callaghan. And our session has gone on quite a bit longer than I'd promised our witnesses, so I do apologise for that. But you have given us a lot of your time and also a lot to think about. So I'd like to thank Professor Ken Muir and Professor Graham Donaldson for what they have given us this morning. Thank you very much, gentlemen. And the public part of today's meeting is now an end. I will now suspend the meeting for a couple of minutes to allow members to reconvene on Microsoft Teams for us to consider the final agenda item in private. Thank you and good morning.